Hello, Night River 6th grade history students and parents. Mr. Dawson here. Going to go over a quiz review for you. We have a quiz coming up this Friday about the topics and information we have covered this week in our immigration unit. We'll be in our immigration unit at least one more week next week, and then following that, we're planning on getting into the Jim Crow era, which is talking about that time period and all the things that were going on then. But for this week, let's get back to that. I'm going to go through the slideshows that we did in class really quickly, just so you have a recap of everything we've talked about this week, and hopefully are well prepared for your test on Friday, or quiz rather, on Friday. So we learned about the difference between immigrate and emigrate, which are, sound almost identical. To immigrate is to arrive to and live permanently in a new country. When we talk about immigration in the U.S., most people are moving here, so they're arriving here. They are immigrants. And then to immigrate is to leave your native country. Basically, you need to know this one, to immigrate to the United States. This map we looked at, and we want to focus mainly on this one over here, and it shows just how rapidly the population within the United States grew. The map starts at 1790 with about 10 million residents in the United States, and it just goes up and up. Really takes off here after the Civil War, or actually here, and goes up exponentially for the next few decades. We talked about old immigrants versus new immigrants. Our old immigrants are considered to be from the Northern European countries like Ireland, Germany, and United Kingdom. These groups were coming over in large numbers prior to the Civil War. They didn't stop coming after the Civil War. They continued to come, but they were joined by these other groups. So these are our old immigrant groups, Ireland, Germany, and United Kingdom, who came before the Civil War. Some of the reasons they came was the Irish potato famine in 1845, where literally thousands, maybe even millions of people died from starvation. They had the gold rush in California, which pulled a lot of people to the United States. And in Germany and other countries in Europe, there were several revolution-type events that failed. There was lots of warfare going on, so people moved to the United States in hope of a better life. All right, this map just shows those old immigrants coming from Northern Europe and those new immigrants, which are from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, mainly from Italy and places like Poland and Hungary, started to come over later, so more after the Civil War. All right, again, these are our new waves of immigrants. The old, again, were Irish and German. The new were Asian, but mostly the biggest numbers were from Italy and Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Russia. And this map is pretty cool. It shows you just how many people immigrated to the United States during this time period. This is talking mainly the 1820s up through the 1920s, and the majority of this happened after the Civil War. So we had, again, our old immigrants coming from Northern Europe, our new wave of European immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, totaling 11 million, and I've seen some estimates higher than that. Some coming up from Mexico and Latin America, less than 100,000, 250,000 Asian immigrants, and from Canada, our next door neighbor to the north, almost a million came down. So lots of immigration into the United States. All right, push versus pull factor. A push is a reason to leave the country you are in, so your home country, a reason to leave your home country. Whereas a pull factor is something good or attractive about the United States that attracted people here. All right, we talked briefly about what a peasant was and how that life in Europe was hard. If you were born a peasant, you're probably going to stay a peasant. The governments in Europe were oftentimes oppressive. And you can see here the stark difference between the life of a peasant and the life of the elite ruling class in Europe. And America versus Europe now. In America, you had the opportunity for free land, unfortunately at the expense of Native Americans in many cases. But in Europe, if you were born without land, you would probably die without land. In America, you had religious freedom. It's written into our Constitution. In Europe, oftentimes the state would decide what religion you had to follow. In America, you had democracy. You could vote for your leaders, whereas in Europe, you might have a king or queen or some other type of oppressive government. In America, you could definitely go adventuring. And in Europe, again, if you were born into a certain state, you're probably going to stay that way the rest of your life. Little hope for change. All right, then we talked about Ellis Island and how it was the main point of entry for most of the immigrants coming from Europe. There were other ports of entry as well, but Ellis Island was the big one. And we did a project. You guys should know all about Ellis Island. We did an assignment, rather, I'm sorry. This is a picture of the steerage, called the steerage area of a steamship. You can see how crowded it was. No privacy for those immigrants coming over from Europe. All right, I'm going to go through this real quick. And here again, our reasons for increase in immigration: hope for better opportunities, desire for religious freedom, escape from oppressive governments, and desire for adventure. And you should have in your notebook a graphic organizer in the fashion of this over here. All right. We talked about discrimination and how oftentimes in the United States, new immigrants would face discrimination for various reasons. So we wrote this down in our notebooks, and I wanted you to focus on discrimination and to know what it meant. We have some other words that mean similar things, and we just touched on those briefly. So the main one we're talking about is discrimination. All right, and we talked about different immigrant groups that came into the United States and types of discrimination that they might have faced as they entered. The Chinese, it was language, racism due to them looking different. Irish, sometimes it was religious persecution. They were many of them followed the Catholic faith. They were moving into a country that had been predominantly Protestant. So sometimes they faced persecution or discrimination on account of that. Jewish people, the same thing, a different religion. The Italians had a language barrier, and a lot of them were Catholic. And again, they were moving to a predominantly Protestant country at the time. And then lastly, the Polish. I don't know a lot about the Polish other than their language difference. All right, again, just touched on our old immigrants again from Ireland and Germany, and these are the areas of the country where they predominantly settled. And then our new immigrants, they kind of went all over the place: Russia, in New York and Georgia, Italy, West Virginia, Sweden and Norway, and Minnesota and the Dakotas. So kind of all over the place. All right. We use New York City as an example to talk about the melting pot that is the United States, where all these different nationalities and ethnic groups were moving into the United States at once. There were cultural challenges. We talked about different cultures around the world, whereas we in America, prior to COVID, we used to shake hands when we met someone. In Japan, they might bow. In the Middle East, they might greet you with a kiss on the cheek. Talked about the different foods that our immigrants have brought in over the years that have become Americanized, and we don't even consider them ethnic foods anymore. And again, to talk about the discrimination, these were newspaper clippings. These were real things. No Irish need apply. No Italians allowed. So they faced some real discrimination, these immigrant groups, as they came over. The Chinese were treated particularly harsh, and we'll talk about them more on the next screen, I think. Yeah. We talked about, and you wrote in your notebook, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which literally banned further immigration from China. So no more Chinese immigrants were legally allowed to immigrate into our country after 1882. And I think that stayed in place for a long time, maybe up until 1954 or something. You know. And again, we talked about our new immigrants mostly settling in urban areas. Urban means city or highly populated areas. So New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, over to Chicago, St. Louis, Boston, and cities like that. All right, let's go to Thursday and Friday's work real quick, give you a quick recap. Now, you will not be tested on Friday's work, so I'm just going to go through Thursday. Urban means city, heavily populated areas. Rural means country, living in the country. Countryside, sparsely populated area. Just make sure you know what urban and rural mean. It will be on the quiz. All right, why did cities grow after the Civil War? Several reasons. Economic growth in the U.S., heavy immigration. Many rural Americans moved to cities in search of jobs in factories, and they were able to leave their farms because there had been improvements in farm equipment requiring less manual labor on farms. The introduction of a new steel manufacturing process was brought here by Andrew Carnegie, mainly in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we were able to produce steel in mass quantities, able to build skyscrapers and pack lots of people into small areas. Cities grew a lot because of specialized industries. Again, I'll mention Pittsburgh. It's known as the Steel City. They still make a lot of steel in Pittsburgh today. New York with the finance industry. Chicago is known for the meat packing industry. All right, so where did all the newly arriving immigrants live? Oftentimes they lived in things called tenements, which is basically, you can think of it as like an apartment building, but really crowded, sometimes unsafe. You might only have enough room to lay out a little cot or even sleep on the floor. There might be lots of people living with you inside a tenement. Ghetto is another term I want you to know. And we sometimes hear ghetto and we think it's a bad neighborhood or something like that. Not necessarily the case. They were, in our time period we're studying, they were known for being a neighborhood or part of a city occupied by a minority group. So oftentimes new immigrants would move into a city and they would kind of gather in common areas of the city. The Italians would be in one part, the Irish in another, and so on and so forth. All right, and here is a map kind of showing what were called ghettos. A lot of times they were run down. They weren't the best parts of town. You can see here, this is from Newark. That's in New Jersey. The Italians here, the Irish here, the Italians over here, Germans, Slavs, so people from Russia and Eastern Europe, Chinese. So they kind of stayed in their own neighborhoods, at least until they were assimilated and become more Americanized. All right, these are some tenement buildings, and you can see people were working with whatever they had. They were hanging their clothes at windows, very crowded. This is a picture of the inside of a tenement, and you can see there's tons of guys living in this small area. All their personal belongings are here, and they're just finding somewhere to lay down and go to sleep, basically. Another picture of a tenement, a very small space. People laid out on the floors. Not very good living conditions. All right. So because of these problems that immigrants faced, bad housing, low wages, language barriers, no education, this lady founded what were called settlement houses. Her name is Jane Addams. Jane Addams founded these things called settlement houses, and she mainly dealt in the Chicago, Illinois area. But she would set up a settlement house, which was a place where newly arriving immigrants could come, or they didn't even have to be newly arriving. They could just need help. They could need help finding a job or finding good housing or having someone watch their children during the day while they work. During this time period, there was not a lot of social safety net out there in terms of government programs to help people. Private citizens often had to take on that responsibility. Sometimes churches or other religious organizations would do similar things. But this lady, Jane Addams, is famous for founding the settlement houses, especially in Chicago. Here's another picture of the inside of a tenement. And we're pointing out here that fire was a big hazard. Here was a poster telling people to keep things off of their fire escapes so they could get out if one of these wood stoves caught the building on fire. Okay. That's it in a nutshell, folks. I hope this was a good, quick review for you. At this time, you can go do your quiz is. Quiz is. First time I've used it. It looks pretty fun. It will ask you questions that are going to be very similar to what you're going to see on the Quiz Friday. And you can take that quiz is as many times as you need to. So do it again and again until you get them right. Parents, if you're helping your children study, I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions for me, always feel free to reach out. Thank you and have a great day.